Hi everybody, it's Lauren. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to be doing my January wrap-up. I'm really excited to talk about all the books I read this month. I managed to get through 7 and I genuinely enjoyed pretty much everything that I read this month. I think that's just because it was the beginning of a new year and this is my first wrap-up of 2018, so I went into reading this year with a really positive and motivated attitude, and that really carried me through all of January. So I'm really excited to talk about all of these books, and let's just go ahead and hop into it. So the first book that I read in January was one of the only ones that I didn't really like very much, and that was Mary Unleashed by Hilary Monahan. This is book 2 in the Bloody Mary duology, and I read the first book last year and didn't end up really liking it. I did an entire spoiler-free review of the first book, which I will link down below and probably on the screen somewhere if you want to go hear my full thoughts on the first book. But I did say that I wasn't going to bother finishing the duology unless I found the second book for like $1. And I guess fate spited me because I actually did find this for like $1.50. So I decided to pick it up and read it just to kind of ease my mind and know what happened at the end. And honestly, I actually really did like this more than the first installment, and I think that's because a lot of the issues that I had with the first book were not present in this one. My issues with the first one were mostly the fact that it was really corny. The author tried to make it scary and add in a lot of haunting and horror elements, and those were not as present in this book. This book focused more on the mystery behind why Mary is haunting these people, how she became a ghost to begin with, and I liked that aspect. I liked the mystery aspect a lot. That's what kept me reading the first book, so to have that in this book more prevalently without more of the cheesy haunting and horror stuff was good. And also, I had issues in the first book with a lot of the relationships being really awkward and weird, and those relationships were not in this book as much, so I like that as well. That being said, I wouldn't say read the first book to get to this one. This book is definitely not by any means worth that. I would say skip the duology as a whole. Now that I've read the whole thing, I was still rather disappointed in this. The writing wasn't that much better. The plot wasn't that much better, and the conclusion did leave me wanting more, but this was an improvement from the last book. I did give this book 3 out of 5 stars, but like I said, unless you've already read the first book and you're kind of on the fence about continuing, I would say this book is worth finishing off the duology, but if you haven't started it yet, I wouldn't recommend bothering with it. The next book that I picked up in January was Jacobi by William Ritter, and I had been really excited to read this one. I absolutely love the cover for this book, and it's one of the first things that drew me towards it, and I was really excited to finally have a copy of it to read. This is basically a Sherlock Holmes meets supernatural kind of book where we're following a young girl named Abigail Rook. Abigail wants to be an archaeologist, but her mother and father don't feel like this is a proper path for her, so she takes her tuition money that's supposed to be going towards her boarding school education and runs off. But the archaeological dig doesn't pan out, so she finds herself penniless, jobless in America. She answers a job wanted ad for a Mr. Jacobi, who is a paranormal investigator. Jacobi has a second sight and can see the supernatural aspects to a murder mystery, and she ends up becoming his assistant. Now, I really did like the story, but honestly this book was a little bit too simplistic for me as far as mysteries go. I pretty much knew who the culprit was about a third of the way into the book, and the reason I kept reading was to find out what the culprit was, not so much who he was. I loved Jacobi as a character. He was so quirky and weird and fun, and his house was super colorful and had all of these interesting aspects to it, so that part of the book was really good. But I didn't like Abigail as a character. She was a little bit annoying, and I felt like most of her job was to remind readers of the clues that were in this book, which honestly weren't that complicated, and I feel like she was there as an expositional character, and I just didn't really like her. She was a little bit annoying. There was a romance in here, but thankfully it wasn't between Jacobi and Abigail. I feel like that would have been really uncomfortable and awkward, but I didn't really like the romance in this book either, and honestly it was just kind of a subpar mystery. I believe I gave this book 3 or 4 stars, I can't remember off the top of my head, but honestly I think this is one of those book series that I probably wouldn't continue to purchase, and instead I'll just get the other books from the library. It was good and I am curious about it, but I'm not sure I'm curious enough to keep purchasing them. Next, I reread The Haunting of Louisiana by Barbara Sillery. This is probably one of my favorite books about haunted locations that I've ever read. I honestly really like to read about haunted locales and things, but those type of books are really hit or miss. And I find that most of the time they're really corny and cheesy, and they focus on like tourist encounters and not so much the history of the location or why it's actually haunted. And Barbara Sillery does a fantastic job delving into the history of each location and more focusing on the lives of the people who've passed through and how the building came to be. I really appreciate that aspect. Maybe other people like the other part of reading about paranormal experiences, but I appreciate that the actual like talk about the hauntings is limited to a very small part of each segment, and it's more about the history of the location and the people who live there that might be haunting the location, instead of like, oh, I felt a cold spot when I walked through this room. I find those books to be corny, and this is not that. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars just because I really enjoy the way Barbara Sillery portrays haunted locations. She focuses on a wide range of spots to visit throughout Louisiana, so I just really like the way this book is set up and the way that it portrays hauntings, and if you're interested in that kind of thing, I do recommend checking this one out. Next, I picked up By Your Side by Casey West. Honestly, I didn't really enjoy this book at all. And that's sort of my fault because this is definitely not the type of book that I like to read. I was just trying to broaden my horizons. I've never read a Casey West book. I'm definitely not a big YA contemporary romance fan, and I picked this one up because a lot of people really seem to like Casey West's writing. She gets generally good reviews, and this was the one book out of all of hers that seemed the most interesting. We're following a girl named Autumn who gets trapped in a library over the weekend, and at first she thinks she's in there alone, but then she realizes she's actually locked in there with a boy named Dax, who's kind of the rebel boy of the school, the loner who's been in juvie, and they think they have nothing in common until obviously they're kind of forced to interact, and a little romance starts brewing between them. Now that sounds really cute, but I honestly felt like the writing was really mediocre. Honestly, the story wasn't bad. I was kind of surprised because I was at least curious throughout the entire novel, so I actually kept reading it, and I did enjoy the story, but the writing was not the reason why. The characters weren't bad. I can't really complain about anything because I already know that I'm biased towards not liking this type of book, but if this is something that you enjoy, I would recommend picking it up. It wasn't terrible. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars because it was very average and the writing just lacked, but the story was cute and overall it wasn't a terrible experience. So the next book that I picked up was Sky Burial by Shin Ran, and this is a book that I had never heard of before, knew nothing about before I read it, and it ended up blowing my mind. I think this is my favorite book that I read in January because it was just so phenomenal. This book follows the story of Shu Wen, who is a woman that the author was fortunate enough to meet. Shu Wen was a woman whose husband was sent off to be an army doctor in Tibet, and he ended up being killed in action. When the report came back to Shu Wen, however, she didn't really believe that her husband had been killed in war because they couldn't tell her anything about the circumstances surrounding his death. So Shu Wen decided to go to Tibet herself as an army doctor and try and find out what happened to her husband, and she ended up not coming back for 30 years. I think that the fact that, first off, this book is actually based on someone's real life is amazing, considering what happens to Shu Wen over the course of this story. It was amazing. But this book kind of originally came off to me as being just a love story about Shu Wen trying to find out what happened to her husband, and it ended up being so much more than that. What this book really was this gorgeously crafted love letter to Tibet. And honestly, before reading this, I didn't really know too much about Tibet. Even though I focused on East Asian studies when I was an undergraduate, Tibet is an area that's not really focused on. And I learned so much about that culture reading this book. There's so much discussion about Tibetan nomadic way of life and religion and monasteries and, different religious practices and household practices, and it was just phenomenal. I cried. It was just so beautiful. The writing was beautiful. I highly recommend this. I think that this is a book that probably no one's ever heard of, but more people should read. It was really short. I could not put it down. I read it in a day. It was just gorgeous. It was a gorgeously crafted book, and I just really want more people to read it because it was just phenomenal, and I loved it, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. The next book I picked up was The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie, and I read this book to fill one of the squares on my diversity bingo board. Now, if you're not familiar with Diversity Bingo, it was a reading challenge in 2017 where the goal was to get people to read more diverse books, so each square on the bingo board was a different diverse topic. But since I didn't really find out about Diversity Bingo until like the end of 2017 and I didn't have time to participate, and there's not a 2018 version, I just decided to take the prompts and move them into 2018 and try and read them this year because they're obviously all still really relevant. So this book I used to fill the box for Indigenous main character own voices. And if own voices just means that it's about a diverse main character or setting written by someone who is a part of that diverse community or setting. And in this case, both the main character and the author are Spokane Indians. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, by the way. This book focuses on a boy named Junior who lives on a Spokane Indian reservation. His family is very, very poor. Alcoholism runs rampant on the reservation. Junior is also the victim of a lot of bullying because he was born with too much cerebral spinal fluid in his brain, and this has left him both a little bit mentally and physically disabled. Now, Junior kind of sees, looking around his reservation, that the only way he's really going to have a future is if he gets off the reservation. So he decides to go to the all-white high school outside of town, and he's literally the only Indian there except for the school mascot. And this book just kind of deals with him dealing with life and growing up and being an adolescent. If you Google famous YA books, this is almost always on the list, and it's just a book I've never really read before. I honestly ended up really, really loving it. I think that it handles racism, it deals with, living on a reservation today in a very, very accurate and sadly just heart-wrenching portrayal. Alcoholism and racism and poverty are very serious problems affecting Native Americans today, and this book touched on all of those topics. It was very difficult to read at times. I cried, I laughed, and I really enjoyed it. It was a good story, and it just really dealt and felt authentic about, growing up as a young adolescent boy and having to deal with all of these other difficult topics. That being said, I could only give this book 4 out of 5 stars because I did have 2 issues with it. The first one is that because it's written from the perspective of a 14-year-old boy, there's a lot of dirty humor in here, there's a lot of sex talk and crude talk, and I feel like while that's true to the character, I wish it had almost been left out because I would have enjoyed reading the book more if those parts had not really been so prevalent. And also, just keep in mind that Junior really talks about himself in a negative way. He uses the word retard in reference to himself a lot. There's some racial slurs in here that I didn't really like reading, and because of that I had to dock a star for this book. But it is definitely worth a read if you haven't. I understand why this is considered like a classic YA novel, and it was really, really good. I did really enjoy my time with this one. So the last book that I read in January is not a book per se, and you'll forgive me if I don't hold it up for the entire time because it's really heavy, but I read and looked through Assassin's Creed: The Complete Visual History by Matthew Miller. Now, I have mentioned it several times on this channel before, but I am a huge Assassin's Creed fan. It's one of my favorite video game franchises of all time. And this was a Christmas gift from one of my dear friends. What this is basically an art book / conceptual history book about the entire Assassin's Creed franchise. So it goes into detail from the very first game all the way up through Syndicate, and it also talks about the merchandise and memorabilia and spin-offs of the whole series. So I just absolutely loved this. If you are an Assassin's Creed fan, this is definitely one of those collector's pieces that I feel like you would love, and it's full of stunning artwork. There's not a page here. Let me see if I can hold up some of the artwork for you guys. There is literally not a page in this book that is not full of just gorgeous artwork. There's full color pictures. It talks so much about all of the different assassins, why they chose to design them the way they did, why landscapes look how they do, the different symbolism between, you know, the locations they picked, just anything you could ever want to know is in here. I absolutely love looking at it. It goes into so much detail. The artwork is all so beautiful. So let me show you one of my favorite pieces. This piece from Assassin's Creed Black Flag, where it shows how gorgeous the undersea environments were crafted. I think that's so beautiful. There are so many pretty pictures in here, and it was just so interesting to see all of the different history and thought that went into crafting the game. So I absolutely love this book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. It was a great read for fans of the franchise or video game fans. It's definitely one of those coffee table collector's books, but I'm so glad that I have it and I highly recommend it. So definitely a really great way to end the month. And yeah, that is everything that I read in January. Like I said, I had a pretty good reading month in January, and I genuinely loved everything that I read. And I'm really hoping that I can continue this momentum into February and read a ton of books as well, because I have a ton that I bought in January that I'm really looking forward to reading. So you'll probably see all of those in my January book haul, which I'll be posting in a couple days. But yeah, that's it for this video. I would love to know what you read in January that you absolutely loved or that you couldn't stand. Either way, let me know down below in a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of my videos, and don't forget to give this video a thumbs up because it lets me know I'm doing a good job and it helps other people find it as well. I hope you're all having a fabulous day, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye everybody!